Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Kelly Tebow, and I'm with the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, and I will be your organizer for this evening and would like to welcome you to our webinar on learning systems, how to improve, build, and develop compensatory strategies. Thank you all for joining us. Before I have my colleague introduce the speaker for tonight, I'm going to cover some housekeeping items with you. All participants are muted. If you have a question, please type it in the bottom of your question box and click send. You may send questions during the webinar. However, we will have Dr. Allen answer the questions at the end of her presentation. We will get to as many queries as time allows. And in addition to tonight's presenter is available to take your questions on the Wednesday webinar blog, which is accessed from our homepage under the heading Programs. This blog will be monitored for the next 7 days. Feel free to look and post questions as often as you like. Answers will be archived for future reference. If you missed part of the presentation or would just like to watch it again, an archived version will be posted to our website shortly. We value your input, and in order to expand the webinar experience in the future, we need everyone to fill out the survey as you exit the webinar. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees, assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate for any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introduction of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the webinar coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Thanks, Kelly, and good evening, everyone. I'm delighted that you could join us. Before I introduce tonight's presenter, I'd like to take a moment to draw special attention to a few upcoming events that have specific deadlines. Ask the Greats will present another of their facilitated interactive webinars on April 22nd at 8 p.m. Eastern with 3 young adults, all with TS, who will discuss transitioning to college. April 6th is fast approaching, and it's the deadline for NJCTS college scholarship applications. Applicants must be a New Jersey high school senior with a Tourette Syndrome diagnosis, graduating this June and attending college or trade school in the fall of 2018. Family Retreat Weekend will be at Camp Bernie again this year. Registration deadline is April 27th. This is a great weekend for parents and kids to meet and spend time with other parents and kids who are experiencing similar challenges at home and in school. Details regarding the registration for all of these events are available on our website. Now to the introduction of tonight's presenter, Dr. Sarah Allen. Dr. Allen received her PhD in clinical psychology with a concentration in pediatric neuropsychology from Drexel University. She is the executive director of neuropsychology at Brain Behavior Bridge in Burlington County, New Jersey, and assistant professor of psychology at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. Dr. Allen specializes in the area of evidence-based interventions for schools as well as in school-wide concussion management and recovery programming. Her work focuses on translating medical and neuropsychological intervention to schools, specifically promoting and integrating brain-based learning approaches in the classroom. She has a primary interest and expertise in building executive functioning skills through interventions that combine neuropsychology with behavioral approaches. As a member of the Child and Adolescent Committee of the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey, as well as through her clinical work, she has worked closely with medical and school professionals to design and implement return to school programming for students with concussions as well as other brain injuries. Dr. Allen, we are so pleased to have you join our webinar lineup. And now, without further introduction, I'm going to turn tonight's presentation over to you.
Wow, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm excited to be here tonight and of course excited to talk about the brain, which is one of my favorite things. And tonight specifically I'm going to talk about learning systems in the brain. So the title today, as you've been told, is Learning Systems, How to Improve, Build, and Develop Compensatory Strategies. So as an outline for tonight's talk, I really want to focus on things other than academic content in the classroom. We always focus on the actual academic content to learning, but those of you who are joining us tonight likely are aware there's much more than that happens in a classroom. So first I'm going to give you a little bit of a background in the brain, just basic background so we can talk about how the brain learns. Then I'm going to highlight 4 systems for learning: cognitive, executive, emotional, and behavioral. And these are key aspects to putting a profile together for a child's learning and also for their intervention strategies. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some recommendations for improving children's functioning, building skills, but also developing strategies to promote learning as well. So I don't want to scare too many people, but first we're going to start talking about the brain. So this is the orientation of the brain that I want to give you, and it really only works in one way. The brain's responsible for processing information from the environment and then producing a response or an adaptation to that environment. So just to give us a general layout here, you have the front of the brain up in the pink section to your left, called the frontal lobe. The back of the brain is the occipital lobe in green there, and that occipital lobe is primarily responsible for visual information. From the back of the brain in the occipital lobe, that visual information will go to one of 2 places, either your parietal lobe, up in the blue section there, which really is primarily responsible for visual and nonverbal aspects to your environment. So it really tells you where something is in that environment. Also from the occipital lobe, visual information will go to the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is down there in yellow, and that's responsible for understanding the environment in a number of ways, not just with visual information, but for visual information it will tell you what's in your environment. Now that temporal lobe in general is responsible for, again, understanding your world in a language way as well. So comprehension of language is down in that temporal lobe. Also in that temporal lobe, and I'll get to it more in a second, is mostly your learning and your memory, and I'll talk about those locations in a second. Another key part to the brain that I like to mention is these 2 highlighted sections here in pink and blue. One in front of the central sulcus and one behind it. The sulcus is just a location marker in the brain. And these are for your motor, which is up in the front, which is a production, motor production. And then the blue, which is in your parietal lobe, is for sensory information, so touch. And the reason that those things are important is because generally speaking, from that central sulcus back, it's about interpretation of your environment. From the central sulcus forward, so from your frontal lobe, it's much more about producing a response to the environment. And so that could include output for learning, it could include your behavior, it could include your motor output, social output, and so forth. We also have areas of the brain towards the bottom, the cerebellum, the pons here, and I'll talk about those a little bit in a second. Cerebellum is responsible for coordination. We used to think it was just motor movements, but now we know it could also be coordination of cognitive thought as well. And then these lower areas, the pons and the medulla, are in a part of the brain called the brainstem. And this part of the brain is responsible for very basic functions like heart rate and breathing and so forth. So I promised I'd talk a little bit more about these, the deeper parts of the brain, which is really an essential distinction when we're talking about learning. So you have areas of the brain called cortical areas, which are the areas up here in light pink. When I mentioned all of those lobes of the brain, those would be cortical areas. When you open the brain up like this and look at a slice like this, so we're basically taking half the brain and looking in from the ear side, this shows you subcortical areas, or areas that are underneath the cortex. And these are deeper in the brain. They're well protected in the brain because they're really responsible for learning. And learning evolved primarily to just keep us alive. Is this a snake that I should go towards or go away? I need to learn that, and I need to remember that very quickly for my survival. So these are stuck really deep inside the brain. So parts that are important when it comes to learning are these subcortical structures along with the cortical structures, because it's the connection between the two that become primarily important for output in learning. The parts that I want to talk about here are pituitary gland, which is the hormone gland, and that's run by a part of your brain called the hypothalamus. That hypothalamus really determines bodily reactions. The way your body reacts is determined by what your hypothalamus tells your pituitary gland to do. Then you have the thalamus in the center of the brain here, and that is really a relay station for information. So all of the processing of your world goes through that thalamus and out to other parts of your brain. So that includes things like visual information, auditory information. The only sense that doesn't go through the thalamus is actually smell and your olfactory bulbs. And your olfactory bulbs are actually tied, just fun fact, to your hippocampus, which is the part of your brain for learning and memory. So smell is actually tied directly to your learning and memory centers, which is why smell can provoke such an immediate memory. All other senses go through the thalamus, so they're getting processed before they get spit out to the parts of the brain that need to understand them. The basal ganglia here is also a major part of the brain when it comes to learning. Basal ganglia is responsible for routine learning, anything you do, things like riding a bike, motoric routine like that, but also things like some obsessive or compulsive behaviors are initiated in the basal ganglia. So continual checking, hand washing, those kinds of things are thought to be associated with the basal ganglia. Now we can use this basal ganglia and kind of trick it later, and I'll talk about that as we get towards the end to help our kids become more functional. The amygdala is also a key part I want to mention. I had a teacher that used to call this part of the brain Amy G. Dalla because she's so emotional, and she really is, because she's the emotion center of the brain. She's not the only part of our brain that deals with emotion, but she's that instinctual primary emotional response. So that's the amygdala there. And next to that is the hippocampus. Now, something to know about the brain is that the things that are close together tend to talk, and the things that talk tend to wire together. So anything that talks to each other is going to be close to each other and is also going to be associated with learning here. So we know emotion and learning must be highly tied because the amygdala and the hippocampus, the two areas responsible for those things, are highly connected. Now, when it comes to our learning systems, our cognitive, executive, emotional, and behavioral, the cognitive system is really a whole brain activity. This is about connection. It's about getting information from that hippocampus and getting it out towards the front of the brain so you can produce a response. So it really has a lot to do with all these different parts of the brain. Brainstem, very basic functions again. Hypothalamus for more of those regulatory functions, which it does through hormones. And then the thalamus, again, for processing some of that sensory information. Now, the executive system that we'll talk about in a little bit is primarily a frontal lobe task. So it's all about control. Executive skills are all about control, and that's in the frontal lobe of the brain. And that is actually the area that develops last in brains in general, that evolves last. And this area is really about stopping us from doing things. And it's that control that separates us from other animals and really improves functioning. So it's one of the reasons we give kids with ADHD stimulants. It sounds funny to give a kid who's already kind of either hyperactive behaviorally or cognitively extra stimulation, but it actually takes more brain power to hold things back and control them. So we're giving them more power for that. And again, that's one of the things that separates us, that ability to control. I mentioned the emotional system too. That is primarily involves the amygdala, which is part of something called the limbic system. When we talk about emotion, we talk about the limbic system, and that includes both the amygdala and the hippocampus and other structures that are responsible for learning, memory, and behavior. And then finally, the behavioral system. Again, this is a whole brain activity. This one's initiated more subcortically, so in some of these structures you see here, and then controlled again by the frontal lobe. Okay, so then I want to also review a bit about some learning efficiency facts, and these become important when we talk about ways that you can impact learning. So there are both what we call progressive and regressive events. So a progressive event would be something like making brain connections, so having our neurons connect. Our neurons are cells that connect via either via both electrical and chemical signals. But we also have some regressive events as well. A regressive event for us is something that happens between the ages of 0 and 5, and this is what we call the pruning process. So this is a picture here of part of your neuron. These are neurons called the dendrites. You can see here they kind of look like branches, which is why we call it pruning. And the pruning process is a key process that happens based on your environmental experiences. So kids are born with way more neurons than they're ever going to have. This picture here is actually my daughter at the age of 2. So she, in this picture, has double the amount of neurons that an adult will ever have in their entire lifetime. Which, although she looks very happy about it here and thinks she knows everything in this picture, she always says, I know Dad. That is not the case. You want actually less neurons, not more to some extent. And this pruning process, through your experiences, you determine what you need to keep and what you need to toss. So anything that you use and you learn through your environment, so this is visual stimulation, if you smile at your mom and your mom smiles back and you learn that that's a way to engage her socially, you're going to keep those neurons. If you're in an environment where you don't get that interaction socially or environmentally, you're going to prune other neurons away, and these are going to be neurons that maybe you should have kept. So this pruning process is a major process, and we're doing a lot of research right now on autism. This is why things like early intervention is so important, because this is where the most learning happens in a child's actually an adult's entire life. And we really want to make sure that they get the right experiences at a young age so they're keeping the right neurons and tossing the other neurons. So this is, although we call it a regressive event, it's a productive one because we really need this process in order to ensure that our brains are set up properly for the rest of their lives. Now, another thing that happens here is that when the brain becomes efficient, I said less neurons is probably better, but also less activity is a sign of efficiency. So what you're seeing here is a picture of the brain, and the top pictures are the activation that occurs when somebody is first learning a task. It's a very simple task, just kind of a ball toss task. And you can see there's a lot of the brain used. It's almost a whole brain activity when you're learning something new. As these people became more, they mastered this task more, they became more efficient at this task, you can see less and less activation, less strength of activation here. And that's because your brain uses what it needs to learn the activity, but then makes it efficient and basically assigns parts of your brain responsible for that task, and then you don't have the rest of your brain lighting up. Now this frees up these other parts of the brain to do other things. So for example, driving is a good one. So if you recall when you first learned how to drive, you probably couldn't listen to the radio, couldn't talk to anyone next to you, couldn't pay attention to anything. And then today, most of you probably didn't remember how you got home or how you got to work because you were probably on the phone or listening to music or doing something else. That's because your brain holds everything subcortically, so into that basal ganglia that I mentioned earlier, and it can automatically do that task. Now the front of your brain is freed up and able to do all your other thinking tasks for you. So that is when you actually become efficient from a brain-based perspective. Now if we apply some of this to academic functioning, what you can see here is the difference between good writers and poor writers. So we're even seeing brain differences in academic settings based on how kids are performing tasks. So good writers tend to use more automatic processing in the brain. Poor writers tend to actually still be processing the specific visual information and using much more of that initial activity to do that same task. So a lot of this comes down to brain power and the way we use our brain power. Now, I wanted to also review some concepts of learning and development. So you can see here, these are developmental trends and neurogenesis in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is that place for learning and memory. And again, this is a very experience-dependent task. And what we mean by that is that whatever experiences you have in the world determines how your brain's going to look. So you could have two identical twins, even in the identical room, learning identical things, and they're still going to have an experience that's a little bit different just by their location in the room and the way they hear the sounds and the way things look to them. And so you add to that the fact that we don't learn things in exactly the same way in exactly the same room with exactly the same people, and you'll see the uniqueness that is our brain development, actually. So everyone's brain is so completely unique. So if you look here, you can see that seeing and hearing is some of the first things to develop. And basically the way the brain develops is simple tasks get connected first, and then they get more efficient, and then you get more complex tasks and more complex tasks. So first comes seeing and hearing, then we have receptive language and speech production, which we can see kind of peak a little bit before the age of 1, and then start to level out by the age of 5. So we really should see some strong receptive language and speech production skills by then. That doesn't mean that this ends, that just means they're set up fairly well. And then finally, you see the darkest line here, this higher cognitive functions. This is in the prefrontal cortex, and this continues. This graph shows it through about 16, but the most current research is really showing that we are still seeing maturation of the frontal lobe through the early 20s. And finally, I wanted to show this. These are peak brain maturation, so percent of brain maturations across all regions in the brain. And this is one of my favorite graphs because it really does depict what we see in the environment. So you can see right around the age of 3, those of you who work with young kids or who have young kids probably know this, you tend to see a young 2 and an old 2, or a young 3 and an old 3, and that's because they generally go through this, there's some big brain maturation point there, meaning some kids have hit that point yet and some kids haven't, and clearly you can see there's a range here from about 2 to 4. But you can really see this through your preschool years. You can see kids who are kind of ready and able to control their behavior, able to sit on a rug for more than 1 second, able to hold their thoughts and not speak them immediately. All of those things show they're on the one side of the curve versus the other. Then you have another peak maturation, about 7, the age of 7. So that's kind of around this first grade time that you see it. And some kids are kind of ready for first grade, some kids aren't ready. And then my favorite one is right around the age of 12. And I primarily see this in girls, although this is across genders here. It's just very distinct for girls for me. I'll get girls who come in who think boys have cooties and really don't understand them. And then the next 12-year-old will walk in and say, you know, I love boys. Hey, boys, what's up? How are you? And they're wearing short skirts, and you're trying to tell them how to dress appropriately. All the exact same age. And that shows you really that there is a big jump there. Another one is right around the driving age. Well, it used to be the driving age anyway, right around that 15, 16 age range. And again, you see this, kids ready to drive, kids not ready to drive. And I'm just giving you some examples, but there's a number of other cognitive skills that are associated with these maturation increments. And then finally, right around that high school to college transition, we see some kids ready to go to college, some kids not quite ready, likely having to do with the way that their brain is developing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about specifically Tourette's and then other disinhibition syndromes. And I call them disinhibition syndromes because, again, the brain doesn't have a Tourette's button or an ADHD button or an OCD button. All those classifications are just combinations of what we're seeing behaviorally that we group because they're all alike. But when it comes to the brain really only works in one way, and it really only goes wrong in a certain number of ways. So we're just grouping those ways into certain categories. So what I like to look at instead are these cognitive, executive, emotional, and behavioral systems when I'm looking at kids, no matter what their diagnoses are, because these are the systems that make up an individual student, and that will help us determine what skill deficits they have, what strengths do they have, and then how could we use both of those and give a good intervention. So when it comes to Tourette's, I'm sure you've seen these bubbles before, but there's really a huge cross in terms of what you see from kids with Tourette syndrome. You can see inattentive behaviors, obsessive compulsive behaviors, tics, obviously, and then all these other things in between, some social issues, some, you can see some academic difficulties. So these are all just, and there's mixes of these all around. So again, I want to go through more specifically and talk about these different systems, especially when it comes to learning, because that's how I think it's the most appropriate to talk about kids as these unique individuals. So let's start with the cognitive system. When I was originally asked to do this talk, we talked a lot about memory, you know, and I think a lot of parents and teachers often say kids don't remember things. Memory, as you saw on the previous slides, is very deep inside the brain. So it's not typically a core memory issue unless you've had a pretty severe traumatic brain injury, or as an adult if you have a very focal injury. Kids don't tend to get those as much. We still see them, but we don't see them as much. So really when it comes to memory, what typically happens is they didn't learn it, or they can't show you they learned it. So I want to talk about the cognitive system as your capacity for learning. So what are kids capable of learning? And in this case, there's getting it in, keeping it in, and getting it out. So I talk about them as attention, learning, and connection. And this cognitive system, this capacity for learning, is sustained or supported by all of these other systems, the executive, the emotional, and the behavioral system. Let's start with attention. So there are two things to talk about when it comes to attention in the brain. The first is this involuntary attention, which is a very basic attention. This is just alertness. So basically kids that aren't sleeping in your class have this involuntary attention. But the one we talk about when we're typically talking about learning and attention in the classroom is voluntary attention. And this is a very frontally based task. So this is getting it in. So if a child isn't attending to the material in the first place, they can't keep it in and they can't get it out. So the first thing to do is to ensure that the child is getting it in. And there are complications with getting it in when you get to these other systems that I'm going to talk about. Just as a little preview, as an example, if a child is inhibiting tics, for example, they're using a lot of the front of their brain for that, so they're not able to pay attention, so they can't get some of the material in. So there's lots of reasons for inattention of the material here. Now we'll move to learning. So this is keeping it in. And any of the teachers who are joining us will know a lot about Bloom's taxonomy, and this is really the structure for learning. So first we start out at a lower level of learning and move to higher levels of learning. So it's basic remembering, basic memorization to start, then an understanding, then an application of that material, being able to analyze that material, evaluate the material, and create the material. And the key to learning here is to make sure we're at the right spot of this Bloom's taxonomy. So depending on our children's ability, their capacity for learning, will help kind of give us a sense of where they should be on this chart. And then also their attention to the material and length of time that they've sat with this material will give us a sense too. So when it comes to keeping it in, it's definitely more of a whole brain activity, but you're looking at things like your hippocampus, which is your memory area, and then again your frontal lobe, which is control. So what you do when you learn something is you find old material, you find some kind of base, and you attach learning to that base, and then you form connections in that way. If you don't have a base to attach something to, you won't learn it. And that is the way we process the entire world, because our brains are, they predict the environment, so our brains are always one step ahead of us. And the way that the brain learns is by taking what we already know, what we've already experienced, and adding to that. And that's just basic. So when we talk about structuring our lessons by cueing and bringing up old learning, adding new learning to that, and then telling kids what you're going to learn next time, it's to set up this process of helping them keep it in. And then finally, getting it out. So this is where your connections come in. And this graph, this picture at the bottom is actually a diffusion tensor imaging so DTI scan, and we can actually see now the axons in the brain and the pathways in the brain that connect our information. And so most of the current brain literature right now is really focused on how parts of the brain connect. I spent a lot of time in the beginning telling you what individual parts of the brain are associated with, but really, especially when it comes to kids, it's about being able to connect. The absence of this type of connection would be something like a kid with autism. So certain kids with autism have a lot of focal or a lot of very specific activation, and they can do some very interesting things. They can probably recite an entire movie to you, which is something I could never do. However, the functional use of that is limited, and that's because they can't take that skill and use their pathway connections and connect that material forward and use that in a functional way. So again, a lot of the research is going into this connection, so getting this information out. And if you have ever worked with kids with lower functioning autism especially, and even some of the kids with higher functioning autism, you can actually watch them try to find the right pathway for pulling out information as you continually cue them. You can also watch this actually in a 2-year-old. So those of you, again, work with younger kids or who have younger kids can watch this as the kids grow and they are working on this pruning process I talked about earlier. They're working on this connection. So many times you see young kids say, Mommy, and you're standing there waiting, hoping they find, well, for me, I'm hoping they find the correct pathway to get this information out quickly because they're driving me crazy. But what you're actually watching is them try to create this pathway of information and get this information out. And then as they get older, they stop with that. So now they're able to say, Mommy, I'd like a banana. Or if you want to help them along here when they're in the stage, Mommy, would you like, yes, I would like a banana. And you often hear speech therapists even cue kids to find the right word, or teachers to find the right word. And that's helping them find that pathway. So in any case, when it comes to getting it out, this has a heavy executive load. And I know we haven't gotten to that section yet, but this is really about finding the right information, organizing it, and then producing a response, or even organizing information that came in so that you can get it out here. So executive skills really, again, support this cognitive system. So let's shift to this executive system. Now, this executive system is really the how-to skills. So this isn't pure academic learning. This is being able to absorb that content that's coming at you in the classroom. And for kids with this executive syndromes, or kids who have delays in their executive functioning system development, they really have trouble learning, not because they're not capable cognitively of understanding the material, but because they can't access that material because they can't do these things, which are things like organize and plan. Maybe they have a long-term assignment and they can't figure out how to start that and how to get that out. Or they have a paper in front of them, a test, and they can't figure out what to do first, what to do second, how to get it all done. Flexibility is another one you see. Problem solving. These are often, sometimes these are kids, this can come out socially or cognitively. So socially it could be something like, okay, I want you to go home. You're going to open the door, go in, get your snack, and do your homework. But what do you do when the door is locked? So we think we came up with everything, and this has happened to me. You think you have the best plan, but then the door's locked and the kid doesn't have these problem-solving skills, and now the whole plan doesn't work. So that's part of the executive system as well. Working memory, which is holding the information in your head, so being able to hold information in your mind to manipulate it. So when you're doing a word problem, for example, you're really trying to hold a lot of pieces of information in your mind so that you can manipulate them. Working memory is also a big part of reading. So for kids with low working memory, we also see them have trouble reading, not because they can't comprehend that text, but because they have to remember what happened in the first couple lines in the first paragraph and add that to the second paragraph and add that to the third paragraph. And if there's just too much information, they can't hold that all in their head. Metacognition, which is essential for change. So this is understanding how you're thinking. Again, this is one of the biggest areas of research because we have to be aware of how we're thinking in order to change it. Then we also have control, so emotional control and behavioral control, and I'll talk about those in a second. And then the regulation or inhibition of things. Again, if you're getting my theme, it's that this executive system is about control and organization for learning. Now we also have an emotional system. Again, this is another support system for the cognitive system as well as its own thing. The emotion system is heavily tied to learning in both a positive and negative ways, depending on what's happening with our kids. So this is, again, controlled by the frontal lobe. It's initiated first subcortically. So this, remember Amy G here, Amy G Dallow, the amygdala, that is your initiation of emotion. And once you feel a strong emotion, it needs to be regulated. So your frontal lobe controls that. So let's say I'm really anxious about a test. I feel that through my amygdala, and then my frontal lobe, oh, by the way, my hypothalamus is going to send all sorts of crazy hormones out through the pituitary gland, and my frontal lobe is going to try to chill everybody out. It's going to work really hard to relax the system. Take your breaths. It's okay. It's all good. But unfortunately, that frontal lobe system is also responsible for things like thinking about your math problem and all the things I talked about in the previous slide. So the brain, again, only really works in one way. So control and regulation over thought is the same as control and regulation over emotion. So if I'm really anxious, I'm going to have trouble using the front of my brain to think. And that's a big problem when it comes to emotion. That's the negative side of emotion. But we also have some positive sides of emotion. So the first thing is that when we are feeling good and happy and safe and comfortable, that's a good thing, and that creates this openness for learning. So if you've ever had a really good teacher that you've connected with, just that stability and openness allows you to learn and grow so much more because it creates the stability. The frontal lobe isn't required, and more parts of your brain are able to connect. We can also use this because our emotion system is a salience factor, what I call a salience factor for learning, which means that the stronger emotion you feel, the more you're going to remember something. That's probably one of the primary reasons emotion developed, is to give us an idea of what's really important and what isn't, because our brain is not capable of holding all information. It has to have some kind of judgment and ranking system. So that's your emotion system. So if you find something really funny or really happy or really scary or really sad, you're going to remember those things more. And so I'll talk about that when I get to recommendations, but this is one trick you can use to help your kids learn even better. And then finally, again, one more negative is just for kids who experience these depressive and anxious symptoms, that creates an instability for learning off the bat. So it makes it very difficult for kids to learn when they're feeling these strong emotions on a daily basis. Okay, and the last system I want to talk about is a behavioral system. So if you look here on the right, this is the chemical system. Remember I said that the brain works with chemical and electrical impulses. So this, I'm talking about one of the chemicals in the brain named dopamine. So dopamine is responsible for reward and reinforcement in the brain. So what's great about this behavioral system, this is what drives learning and behavior, this dopamine pathway. So we stick with and we continue to do things we like, and we withdraw from or we avoid things we don't like. Things that feel good we go towards, things that feel bad we go against or we withdraw from. And that's, so if you think about kids with anxiety or emotional syndromes like that, they avoid these bad feelings. But what you can do with the behavioral system is use that system to continue some form of learning. So anytime you reward something or reinforce something or make somebody feel good, they're going to either start something, start a behavior, or continue to do it. This is why we give sticker charts for chores, right? We're rewarding and reinforcing the behavior of doing your chores. And the more that feels good, the more you're going to see chores. Now, punishment is just a stopping system. And I'm only briefly going over this here, by the way. You could do a whole presentation on the behavior system. But punishment is a stop system. So if your child is running across the street and they get swatted on the butt, that is a punishment system that feels very bad very quickly, and they are likely to not cross that street again. Now, what we didn't teach them is how to cross the street appropriately. They didn't build any skills. They just stopped something we were doing. And that's essential when it comes to learning, and I'll get to that in interventions. We have to teach kids skills, replacement skills. We can't just punish or reward something. So anyway, this is your basic learning system. As I said, rewards can increase learning. It's also going to stimulate the frontal lobe of the brain. So this dopamine system is a feel-good system. It's also an attention system in some ways, in a lot of ways actually. So when you're giving more power to the brain through dopamine because you're feeling good about something or you're rewarding the brain, the kids actually have more brain power and can attend better. So oftentimes you'll see kids with ADHD and families or teachers will say, well, yeah, when I give them a reward, they'll do it. See, I knew they could do it. And there's two things I would say to that. One is that the reinforcement system is designed to make their brains want to do that more. And two is that by reinforcing their brain, you're actually providing biologically more chemicals. So you're providing more brain power. And because they have more brain power, they're able to recruit that energy and attend better too. So there's kind of two processes happening there. Okay, so let's go back to learning and kind of sum these up these systems here. So there are connections between your cognitive system, your executive, your emotional, and your behavioral systems, and all of those systems, as I've explained, connect and combine and are important for learning. They must also all be stable. So we can't look at one in isolation. You can't just look at your behavioral system in isolation of the emotional and the executive and the cognitive system. You have to look at all of these systems together. If one system isn't stable, then they all can be thrown off. And if there's a couple systems that are thrown off and you only intervene on one, you're going to miss a lot and you're not going to be as effective as you could be. And also your intervention generally may be ineffective and for the wrong reason though. So I'll talk about that when we get to those interventions. The frontal lobe, as I mentioned, it's a control system. It controls all systems, but it only has so much power. And that's another reason that we need to attend to all these other systems, because as I mentioned, each system, the frontal lobe was involved in all of them. And so it's really getting pulled in a number of directions, and we need to make sure that, again, these systems are balanced to allow the frontal lobe to have as much power as it needs. The emotional system, as I mentioned, contributes to learning and can reduce learning by taking away that frontal lobe power. So again, we want to give it back. And then again, the behavioral system can contribute to learning and be used to enhance learning, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So if we go back to our different disabilities here, what we're seeing is that things, for example, I mentioned with Tourette's, when they're controlling these tics, they can't also learn. So that's how those systems go together, because they're working on controlling this involuntary motor movement, likely from their basal ganglia, and their frontal lobe isn't freed up there. I mentioned ADHD as well. That controlling the behavior and controlling thoughts needs a lot of power. We need to support that in any way that we can. And then again, with that emotional system or emotional disabilities too, when you're controlling emotion or you are unstable, emotionally, you can't learn. So kids are really a function of these four systems put together. They're not just a kid with Tourette's or a kid with ADHD. They're put together very uniquely with these four systems. So I want to shift a little bit and now talk about the application of those systems here. So let's talk about some brain tricks here. So the first is in this cognitive system. So I mentioned the basal ganglia to you earlier. It's one of my favorite parts of the brain. I know you all have a favorite part of the brain. I do too. And it's the basal ganglia because it really can be used to enhance the cognitive system. So if you can teach kids routine and or provide consistent cueing when you're using your intervention, this is really going to pull things out of the frontal lobe and put them more subcortically in the basal ganglia. So I can give you an example from my son. With morning and afternoon and evening routines, that's an example of teaching routines to improve functioning. My son can get up and get ready, and he does. He gets up and he gets dressed. He's 6 years old. He gets his breakfast and he can get out the door. But at the beginning of the school year, you would think he had none of these skills because we don't have a routine. We're not doing the same thing every day. So instead, he comes down the stairs, flops to the floor, and starts screaming. One of the ways I make my child more functional is by adding these routines. And now, as I said, he can get up, get dressed, get ready, and get out the door. Now, if I change the routine, if it's a weekend or if there's a long holiday break, you'll see a decline in the production of those skills, trust me. This is the same thing you can use for organization strategies for homework or schoolwork. If you teach kids how to put things in the same place every time, color-coded notebooks, and you help them and monitor them through that, again, you're freeing up their brains to just be able to consistently do that, and now they can hear what the teacher's saying and catch other material as it's coming through. Because inevitably at the beginning or the end of the class, there's lots of instructions that kids tend to miss because the front of their brains are being used for organizing their materials instead of listening to the teacher. Other brain tricks are in the executive domain here. So one of the biggest things to do would be teach executive skills, and those things will improve access to learning. Again, with a lot of kids, it's not about an inability to learn the academic material, it's about an inability to access this material. So you can do this as a teacher by teaching from an outline or a kind of pre-organizing your material. So in upper level classes, you may use PowerPoint. You can even do that in lower level classes. But these things really help to organize material. So you're teaching kids how to get that information in, and then inevitably how to get it out and how to keep it there. And this is really, I love a Universal Design for Learning approach, a UDL approach. Those of you who are interested in it can look up the CAST website. You can Google CAST and it'll give you this approach. But the idea here is that you prime old learning, attach the new learning to it, and then tell them what they will learn. So the lesson plans are really designed to ensure that you can use your brain to find the old stuff, add the new stuff, and make sure that you'll know where to put the next pieces of information. Other things are like problem-solving approaches. So I worked on with a fellow student on her dissertation. She had a problem-solving approach she called PACT: problems, actions, consequences, and try it. So you make a pact to solve a problem. I know, it was brilliant. So here you can use these things naturally in a classroom. And you can use them at home as well. So for example, I used to play this game with my children when I wanted to make sure we knew what to do when we got home. And I would say, okay, what are we going to do first when we get home? Well, we need to take a bath, we need to brush our teeth, we need to get in our pajamas, and we need to get in bed. Maybe we should get in bed first and then take a bath. And that was, I know I'm very funny, so that was really funny. And then we'd play around with this until we got the right order of things because we were problem solving through that. Another way of doing that would be just to talk out your strategies. In a classroom, you might say, oh my goodness, we have all this material to cover and we have to do that before we go to gym. How am I going to go about breaking up this material? And at first you might talk that out loud, and then you might seek input from your students and kind of make a schedule together. So really you're teaching them how to think and how to start. Excuse me, another example of this would be planning a long-term assignment. So if you're actually incorporating executive skills within your classroom, what you're doing is something like not just here's a book report, but a lesson ahead of time about how they're going to go about starting, completing that, and finishing that. So how do we get this done? And using that class period to prepare, to help kids figure out how to use their executive skills for these things. At home, this could be chores. So instead of just giving kids chores, we say, okay, we have 3 chores to do. Which one should we do first? What order do we need to do? And you're actually walking them through the process of how to make that decision instead of just dictating to these kids what they need to do. And by telling them those things, you're helping their brains learn and grow. So we can also take this to the emotional system here. So really, again, you want to balance emotion for heightened learning. You want to have that nice, stable pathway, but there's also some little tricks you can use that will enhance learning. Things like surprise, interest, curiosity. These are all good things for learning. When something suddenly happens or suddenly makes you think of something that you enjoy, something you didn't expect happens. All of these things are really good tricks for learning. And they're good tricks for attention too. So if I were to go, ah, you know, half of you just jumped up, 3/4 of you probably weren't paying too much attention, but now maybe I called your attention back. So not only did I pull your attention, but whatever I say after that is likely to be remembered more than anything else. Sorry for screaming in your ear. As I said, emotion is the salience factor for learning. So the more positive emotion that you can put around something, the better. Negative emotion also works. So in some of my classes, for example, I might provoke a little frustration by, for example, not giving very specific instructions on a task. We're very rubric driven now, so if I give a presentation in a doc level class or a master's level class and I don't give too many instructions, that really frustrates people. And they have to go through and decide how to do the project and how to put things together. And because of that, they end up finding new research and determining how they want to present something and what's important. And that frustration or that anxiety that was created there is good because that's going to enhance their learning. They learn better than when I just tell them exactly what to do and I don't provoke any emotion. So those being said, we really still want a safe and comfortable base in order to provide the stability for learning in the first place. Then these tricks are useful. Let's move to the behavioral system here. So this behavioral system is great because you can use positive behavioral reinforcement strategies to jumpstart learning. Remember, that's that addition of chemical. That's a good thing. That's what you want. For example, a star chart for completing work. That's going to be a wonderful strategy there. And these kind of jumpstart systems are great as self-monitoring programs too. So you can teach kids to, for example, if you use attention, be aware of that before they change. So if kids don't know what attending feels like and not attending feels like, so often kids don't know when they are or aren't paying attention, they just know their teacher tells them they did a good job or a bad job that period. If we want kids to become more aware, we first reinforce them so that we're jump starting the system again for just matching their teacher's response. This is a self-monitoring program. So if I get the same information as my teacher here, I'm going to get my star. So if I say I didn't pay attention that last 5 minutes and my teacher says, nope, you did not, I get reinforced there. And then once I can match about 90% of the time, then I'm going to move towards reinforcing the next skill, which is actually paying attention. But you have to have those steps in place or you're just going to have a system that isn't effective because kids don't understand, they don't have the skill you need. And I'll talk about that in a minute. If we look at homework, we need to teach the organization of materials, for example, before we reinforce turning in assignments. So if the reason kids aren't turning in their homework assignments is because they can't find them and they can't get them from home to school, if we just say, you know what, if you get it back to school, I'm going to give you a star, that doesn't teach them anything and your system will likely fail. If we teach them an organizational system and reinforce them for learning that organizational system, for using that organizational system, and then for doing it on their own, and then for turning in their assignments, now we really have a nice intervention. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So these are all strategies you can use behaviorally, kind of brain tricks to improve kids' functioning. So I was mentioning in the last slide about building skill. And this is the key. So when we know all these things about these systems, but when it comes to actually having good interventions, we have to determine the area of the skill deficit, keeping in mind these systems, whether it be cognitive, executive, behavioral, or emotional. And we need to really target the skill deficit. So as I said here, if organization is the issue with getting in homework, then our skill is organization, not getting homework in. We first have to teach organization. And when we're doing this, we have to consider things called, something called remediation and compensation, and I'm sure some people are very familiar with this. So compensation is accommodating or going around the problem. This is something like if I have trouble with my fine motor skills and I use a computer to type, that is compensating. I'm not necessarily making my fingers stronger, I'm just I'm just typing. Remediation is making it better, or teaching a skill. So if I'm going to then provide occupational therapy for handwriting, that would be a remediation skill. Now you don't want to do these two things at the same time. So if I'm teaching writing, and I want kids to focus on how they're going to organize and get the written word, meaning their thoughts out, then I'm not going to also make them handwrite something. I'm going to let them compensate for that skill. So I'm going to let them use the computer while I'm teaching them a different skill. So here's kind of the push-pull when it comes to compensation and remediation. And it really has to do with severity of skill deficit, as you see on the left, and age. So the older you get, the more compensatory strategies you're likely going to use. So as you get older, you're going to start using a calculator, for example, because at a certain point, we're done with those basic skills and we need to give you a compensatory strategy to continue to move forward in math. That's one example. But as kids are younger, or if their severity of their deficit is more mild, we're going to use more remediation strategies. So how do you design these academic interventions? Again, or intervention programming in general, skill programming in general. Again, this could be an entire presentation, but just to give you a little bit here, first you have to determine what systems are impacted. So we talked about the 4 of them. And are they all stable or do they need some work? Then we have to think about prerequisite skills. Then we move on to this right balance of compensation and remediation. Think about how we can support these skills across all those different systems. So it might be that they have a skill deficit in one area, but they're also feeling really bad about school. So we have to really work on both of those things at one time. Maybe their relationship with their teacher has really been negatively impacted by this skill deficit because they're frustrated the kid can't get homework in. We need to provide some positive interactions with the student and the teacher. Maybe they play a card game or just do something fun that they both enjoy together, while we also add this remediation or compensation strategy for the skill. Then we need to identify goals. And then one of the hardest things to do is not just teach the skill, but also track and monitor the progress. So oftentimes we see, for example, an executive skill. Let's say the executive system was impacted. We might target organization for homework completion and turning in assignments. And then first, again, we're going to teach that organization system, but we're not going to let this child fail. So we're going to compensate by using teacher and parent support there. So generally speaking, this child is going to hopefully get their homework in close to 100% of the time, but we still want to teach this skill. So first, we're going to reinforce the student for using that system. And just getting reinforcement there is also going to boost your emotional system there. So that's a great thing too. So we reinforce it based on using the system first with the help, and then we start to decrease the amount of help, and then we see them using it independently. So basically you can track the use of the system, and then really fun fact tip for anybody working in the school, track the number of cues the students need, because what you'll see is even if they're doing that skill 100%, the number of cues start to go down. And as the number of cues go down, that's a sign that the child has become more independent. So you can track independence by decreasing the number of cues. And in general, independence is what's really important. So we really want to focus on teaching independence here. And as I said, if you look at cueing, it's starting with high levels of cueing and then reducing it over time. It's a great marker for that. But you can also have other strategies to promote learning, like using reflective questioning techniques. These are things that get you to think. So if I were to say, what are reflective questioning techniques? And I paused and I required a response from you. Again, even if you were listening intently to me, which I'm sure all of you are, it would require a response from you, which would generate a production part of your brain. So things like, how do I start this math problem? Or where do we start with this? Where do we start with this project? What do we do first? How should we start this writing assignment? All of those are reflective questioning. And if you pause to use a lot of that reflective questioning style, you're requiring students to engage in the process of how to learn, and that's going to promote learning as well. Again, we need to balance these systems to create this openness for learning. And again, I don't have time to go into this too much, but I always want to promote healthy brain habits as well. So if as a parent or a teacher you're looking to promote health and wellness in the brain, things like exercise. Exercise has been shown to actually generate new neurons in the hippocampus and new connections in our learning and memory centers in our brain. There's healthy brain foods, things like, I was just looking at some research on breakfast. So Kids who don't eat breakfast actually show poorer problem solving and other cognitive skills. Kids that do eat breakfast with a low glycemic index, so something that lasts a while and gives a good stable rate of glucose over the morning, have actually showed improved problem solving and thinking skills and general success. So it's a huge thing to eat breakfast. And then these problem solving practices also require your brain to generate activity. So if I have to summarize here, and I know I'm getting close to time, the brain really only works in one way. So there are a couple rules. One's location, which is things that are near each other are going to talk. And then it's connection. Connection is what's responsible for function. When you're looking at kids, you really want to look at all these brain systems, especially for kids with disinhibiting disorders. You want to consider that cognitive, executive, emotional, and behavioral system. And you want to look at kids as a combination of these systems and not as a function of their disorder. All systems can support or hinder learning. I think that I've made that point pretty clear, hopefully. And then when designing interventions, you really want to think about what do you want a kid to learn and how you support them while they learn that skill. So this balance of compensation and remediation. And then if you're always working to build independence, you're going to strengthen these systems and the connections within those systems. So we're not looking to just maintain kids in a classroom or maintain their function at home. We want to build their skill and build their functioning and prepare them for the next grade or the next year or their next location in life, really. Finally, I want to highlight these resources for you here. Again, I mentioned a couple times, this is a whole nother talk. Well, I wanted to give you some resources for that. So if you look at the first one, if you're interested in learning more about the brain, there's a crash course YouTube channel, and I gave you the link here. It's one of my favorite channels. I use it in my classes all the time, and it gives you across domains, actually, and it gives you a lot of information. So there's that there. If you're looking for some behavioral interventions, I gave you a link to Intervention Central. More information on anxiety and interventions for anxiety, there's a great program called Coping Cat by Phil Kendall, and I gave you a link to that website. And if you're a provider, there's a great workbook that you can use with your kids, and also a therapist manual that I like. And then there's a number of executive skills recommendations there. There's a curriculum, but there's also Peg Dawson is amazing, and if you ever have a chance to check out one of her seminars, not only is she a great speaker and she has some wonderful things to say, but she has 2 books there that I gave you the links for, and she also gives you an entire Dropbox folder of resources, so if you can check her out, I would. George McCluskey is a colleague of mine at Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine who's written a number of books, and I gave you the information there on executive functioning. He's also a great speaker. And then, of course, we have NJCTS, and then I also write a blog for Philly.com, Healthy Kids, so I gave you the links there if you're interested in healthy brain activity. And that wraps me up for today.
Wow, wow, wow. Okay. Do you need a drink or anything first before we start?
I think I'm okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to jump right in here with some questions. I had a question about the Hebb rule. I wasn't familiar with the Hebb rule, but for those listening, it's spelled H-E-B-B. And the question is, where does the Hebb rule come in? And then there's an example given, like kids counting on their fingers during a math computation.
Okay, so these rules are really, I'm trying to think about how to most simply explain this. So really we're talking about connection rules. So we're really talking about the way that you want to, your brain to connect and most efficiently connect. So you want to know how that rule is applied for learning, is that the case?
I would say yes.
So I really think it's about, again, efficiency with learning. I'm trying to think how I could best explain that one. Give me a second. It's really about the idea that the connections that you make, kind of this the ones that fire together, wire together. So you really want to have connections that when you're learning material, you'd like to learn material that goes together. So when I said things like you want to prime old learning and attach new learning to it, you really want to do that because what you're trying to do is get neurons to fire together. So I didn't talk much about neurons, but they're brain cells that we have and the way they work, again, electrical and chemical signals. So what we want to do is get those neurons to connect in a way, in a certain way, and we do that by associating two pieces of learning. So when you're priming old learning and bringing new learning in, you're actually using this Hebbian rule of making two neurons connect together. So that's why it's really important to use that kind of UDL approach that I mentioned earlier and design your instruction to make sure you're doing that.
Okay. Have a question about, you mentioned using an example in a class about frustrating the class with not enough directions and then allowing them to kind of learn through that process. And the question has to do with a proper balance between the use of positive versus negative emotions to elicit learning. And the comment was, would an 80-20 rule work for this? 80 using positive and 20 using negative. And the second part to the question is there an age range during which this a negative emotion is more effective?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is the essential rule to that working is that it is a safe, comfortable environment in the first place. So if the classroom isn't set up to be safe and supportive, using negative emotion is definitely not going to be effective at all. So that's the first step. I wouldn't put an 80-20 on it necessarily. I would prefer to use more positive than negative, but well, I wouldn't. So I would prefer to use more positive than negative. A little bit of anxiety though. So I would say you could even say 20% of anxiety is not a bad thing. So when kids get nervous about a test, a little anxiety is okay. It becomes maladaptive when the function is disrupted. So if a kid's performance is significantly decreased because they're so anxious, then that impairs their function. We know that isn't working. So I think your balance really is dependent on how a kid is functioning. If it looks like it's improving their learning, you're doing a good job of that balance. And if you see declines in performance, then something is wrong. Something isn't working.
But that would certainly then, with that, what you've described there, it would certainly make a difference on the age of the child, or whether you're in elementary, middle, high school. You know what I mean? So that would be a huge problem there, depending on the age.
I think the reason I didn't like giving an 80-20 rule in general is because it depends on the kid's functioning. So if you're always looking at kids as individuals, then yes, maybe an older kid could handle a little bit more, but we're really still looking at that individual balance for those kids about when is a little bit good and when is too much going to tip them over. It just looks different at each age. So for a younger child, you might want to get them involved in some activities, but that makes them really nervous and they get really anxious about being involved. But you're teaching them how to work on that anxiety in order to learn that skill of getting in there. And it kind of makes them a little bit anxious, but then they learn better that way and then they remember that a little bit more. But then for a high school student, it might be they can go through their classes fine, but when they give that presentation in front of the class, that causes them a little bit of anxiety. But they work really hard, they put a lot of time and effort into it, and then they learn that skill a little bit better. So same thing at different ages.
Okay. Would you comment on the evaluation process for an adult with suspected ADHD and what the treatment might be? I don't mean necessarily medication. I don't think they mean medication, but is that something you could comment on?
Yeah, so first of all, just to be clear, I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist, so I primarily see children and I don't assess adults. But what I would say from a brain-based perspective, if you're looking for non-medication options, for ADHD is you can
Yeah,
use
I think that's what it is.
the same tricks that I'm recommending here behaviorally. So for me, for example, I like to do a lot of different things at one time, and focusing on one thing for me is difficult. So what I need to do is put a behavioral system in place. If I can get this presentation done and I can focus on it for this hour, then I'm going to go let myself get that massage at the end of the week. If I can't, I will not. And those are very basic natural systems. Our entire system is set up that way. So you can use these reinforcement strategies to help. And then the other thing that I would say in general is just, again, using that balance of the emotion system too. So increased stress, heightened emotional responses, whether that be anxiety, depressive kinds of feelings, all of those are going to make attention worse because the front of your brain, again, doesn't have that much power. So if you use de-stressing techniques too, you can bring your emotion system down to a level that could improve that executive or frontal or attention system as well.
Got it. Okay. If the brain matures in the early 20s, what happens after that with all of the additional learning? Does it result in a deepening of the maturity, or is the maturation complete and it's just there?
Great question. So when we talk about maturation, but without getting into it too much, we're talking about myelination of neurons, which is what we're talking about. Myelination is a coating on part of your neuron called the axon, which makes the transmission of information go faster. So when we're talking about development in the frontal lobe, we're talking a lot about that myelination event, so you're becoming quicker with it. But after we've gotten rid of all these neurons that we don't need anymore, we're at an adult level, we're at the age of, what, 5 maybe, what we're talking about is connection. So all of our learning is connection driven then. So we don't have new neurons necessarily, but we're going to have those dendrites that I showed you on the when I talked about pruning. We're having those connections from one neuron to another enhanced. And so you're really making neurons connect in a more efficient way. So learning becomes a process of connection, not a process of growth.
Okay. And we have gone a little over. I have one more question, and this is probably a little more of a comment, but this individual is saying that they always saw rewards as an inducement, but never understood why. So the example you gave that there is an actual brain effect by a reward was pretty, not shocking, but I guess pretty interesting to this individual. So that was, I wondered if you could just talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. You know, I think that we're just getting some new great brain research now to show us that whatever we see in, functionally or behaviorally, whatever output we're seeing is actually driven by the brain. So much so, just as a tangential comment, we can see ADHD treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy treatments are actually resulting in the brain changes. The pathways are being connected differently, so we can see actual changes in the brain, which is very exciting. But when it comes to this reinforcement system, yes, it's an actual chemical process. You're providing more power, for lack of a better way of explaining it, to the front of the brain, which allows kids or adults to do more. It gives you that extra jolt that you need. And the key with those behavioral strategies is to, I mentioned that behavioral strategies can jumpstart systems, but oftentimes you'll see the maintenance of those systems, they stop working basically over time. And that's because you want to shift from reinforcing that skill externally to having it be an internal reward. And you always want to continue to kind of up the ante. So whatever skills that you're teaching should belong in a behavioral system, and then once those skills are learned, the behavioral system should be faded, and or new skills should be built, so the expectation will increase. So you first, for example, I might reinforce my kids for getting ready in the morning, but once they know how to get ready in the morning, now I'm going to reinforce them for getting ready in the morning and getting themselves out on time. And then once they're reinforced for that, I'm going to decrease that, I'm going to fade that system, and I don't use any reinforcement system in the morning. Just the idea that they're able to get up and get out on time is reinforcing enough to them. They don't miss the bus. There's no other consequences. These are all good things for them. So that would be the ideal way to set up these behavioral systems.
Yeah. is it, as an adult, as someone, gets older, the reinforcement system, could that be as simple as good job, well done, thank you, sort of thing, as opposed to having it be, is there the same kind of stimulus to the brain when it's more of a verbal thing like that?
If it feels good to that person. So you'll have some kids that don't like praise, for example, that doesn't feel good to them. That is not a good reinforcing system. But if my daughter, for example, today just moved up a level in reading and she was so excited, and all I needed to do was show my excitement and give her this big hug, and you would have thought she won $1 million. That felt good to her. So that was reinforcing to her. I didn't need to give her $1 million. I didn't need to her. She felt really, really good about that. Now, I might have jump-started her system earlier by reinforcing her practice on her reading, but once she bumped up a level, that feels good in itself, and I don't need to do that. And that's what I mean about fading those behavioral systems and allowing that natural quality to come through. That's when you're really going to build skills and work towards independence.
Okay, well, Doctor, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. I'm going to turn this back over to Kelly to do her final wrap-up.
Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Learning Systems, How to Improve, Build, and Develop Compensatory Strategies. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The webinar blog is open now and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to our website. Our next presentation, Unusually Messy and Always Late, Understanding Executive Functioning and Organizational Skills, Challenges for Students with ADHD, will be presented by Dr. Lisa Ahern and is scheduled for April 18th, 2018. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Allen, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Good night.